elementary school Goldfish. Let's assume a recently enacted state law requires teachers to keep goldfish in their classrooms to improve students' understanding of fish life. The Association of Californian Aquariums tells us that all of the major school districts sent letters in support of the legislation while it was being debated in the legislature. Is this a reimbursable mandate? Well, okay, it was freely imposed by state government, and yes, it requires schools to pay for a new governmental program. But by now, you probably remember the part of the slide that says that something is not a reimbursable mandate if it was enacted upon local request. Now, a bill working its way through the legislative process gets lots of feedback. What does local request mean? Is a simple letter of support enough to constitute a local request? In order for a state requirement to be considered a local request, it must be very clear that all affected local agencies requested that the state impose the requirement. A simple letter of support for legislation is not enough. In this case, the governing body of every affected school board would need to pass a resolution requesting that this specific requirement be imposed on them. Well, what if some or all of the school boards did not pass such a resolution? Well, the requirement would be a reimbursable mandate on any school that did not pass the resolution. In this case, no school district passed a resolution requesting the legislature enact this requirement, so it is a reimbursable mandate on all of them. What costs would be reimbursable? Well, the fish, their tanks, food. There also may be some cost associated with teacher training and to make any facility modifications to accommodate the tanks. Multiply these costs by the thousands of schools in the state, and you can see why some minor state requirements can result in costly state mandates. Bus tire tread. Let's assume that Congress enacts a new law that says in order to be eligible for any federal transportation funding, states must ensure that all buses maintain a minimum tire tread for safety purposes. California passes such a law, and school districts experience increased costs to buy new tires for school buses. Are these costs reimbursable? Okay, let's go back to the summary slide. Was this requirement freely imposed by state government upon local agencies? Well, no. In this case, major federal funding was at stake. The federal government essentially coerced the state into passing this law. The consequences of the state not complying with Congress's requirement would have been so major that the state had no practical alternative but to comply. So this criterion does not get a check mark. Does this law require local agencies to pay for a new governmental program or higher level of service? No, this requirement isn't something focused on traditional governmental programs. The requirement applies broadly to all buses in the public and private sectors. So this second criterion doesn't get a check mark either. Given that we haven't met any of the threshold criteria, there's really no need to look at the exemptions. To recap, this tire tread requirement is not a state reimbursable mandate because it was not freely imposed by the state, and the requirement was effectively imposed by the federal government. And the requirement is not for a new governmental program. It applies equally to the private sector. Water meters. The state passes a new law requiring local water districts to meter water with a certain type of time of day instrument. Water districts can recover their costs to install these meters from monthly user fees. But the water boards tell us that they don't want to increase their fees. Their residents were unhappy with the last fee increase. Are meters a state reimbursable mandate? Let's go back to the summary slide. Yes, the meter requirement was freely imposed by state government, and yes, it requires water districts to provide a new type of meter. None of the exemptions apply except possibly the one related to fees. We haven't talked about this provision before. Water districts generally have broad legal authority to offset their cost of providing water through fees. Well, what if local residents or the governing board of the water district doesn't like fees or they vote against them? Frankly, this doesn't matter. If the local agency has authority to offset the cost of the state requirement through fees, the state requirement is not a reimbursable mandate. So this measure is not a reimbursable mandate because local agencies can offset their cost with fees. Do note, though, that the fee revenue needs to be realistic. If meters cost millions of dollars and there are just 3 small homes in the area, using fees probably would not be viewed as realistic. Property tax shift. The next example is based on a real one. In the early 1990s, the state passed a law requiring county auditors to annually reallocate several billions of dollars of property taxes from certain local governments to schools. Thus, schools get more property taxes and some local agencies get less. Is any part of this transaction a reimbursable mandate? Okay, let's go back to the summary slide. In order to be a reimbursable mandate, we need to see a requirement freely imposed by the state and a local agency. Yes, we have that. That requires local agencies to pay for a new governmental program, higher level of service, or share a program cost. Well, where's the new governmental program or higher level of service or share of program cost? We don't see that here. In this example, we see simply a reallocation of local revenue, with some local governments getting less revenues than they got before. There's nothing on the face of this example that sounds like a reimbursable mandate. On the other hand, wouldn't the county auditor have some additional administrative costs to implement the property tax transfer? Yes, auditors would, and these minor administrative costs would be a new program or a higher level of service. So let's place a very small check mark here. And the administrative costs were freely imposed by the state, so we can put another small check mark here. And the administrative requirement doesn't meet any of the exemptions below. So yes, a small piece of the property tax shift measure is a state reimbursable mandate. To recap, revenue losses by themselves are not reimbursable mandates. Sometimes, however, major legislation has a small part in it, something you might not think about at first, that is necessary to implement the measure. Even if most of a state law doesn't meet the definition of a reimbursable mandate, these small administrative matters can. In this case, the reimbursable mandate is the county cost to administer the revenue shift and not the property tax shift itself.